In the quiet town of Toowoomba, nestled atop a dormant volcano and surrounded by dense, mysterious forests, there exists an urban legend that has persisted for generations. The tale speaks of a creature known as Maracaboo, the Smiling Man, a being whose very existence blurs the lines between reality and nightmare. The origins of this enigmatic figure are as varied as they are fantastical, with explanations ranging from the extraterrestrial to the supernatural. Some whisper that Maracaboo is an alien visitor, stranded on Earth and driven mad by isolation. Others, with hushed voices and wary glances, insist he's a demon summoned from the depths of hell, or perhaps a creature from a dimension beyond our understanding. The more historically inclined among Toowoomba's residents point to the ghost of a convict, unjustly hanged in the town square many years ago, his vengeful spirit unable to find rest. However, the most widely accepted explanation, perhaps born from a desire to rationalize the inexplicable, is that Maracaboo is simply a homeless man, driven to the fringes of society and forced to make his home in the shadowy recesses of the surrounding woods. I, like many others who grew up hearing these tales, had always dismissed them as nothing more than local folklore, designed to keep children from wandering too far into the treacherous forests that encircle our town. The stories were entertaining, certainly, but hardly believable to anyone with a modicum of common sense. Or so I thought, until that fateful night when the line between legend and reality blurred, leaving me questioning everything I thought I knew about the world and the dark spaces that exist just beyond the reach of civilization. My name is Liam, and I've always been drawn to the macabre, finding an inexplicable thrill in tales of horror and the unknown. This fascination led me to suggest what I now recognize as a profoundly ill-conceived adventure to a group of my closest friends. The plan was simple, or so it seemed at the time. We would venture into the woods surrounding Picnic Point, a popular tourist destination that marks the very edge of Toowoomba, in search of the elusive Smiling Man. Picnic Point offers breathtaking views of the surrounding landscape, the town sprawling behind us and the vast, untamed wilderness stretching out before us like an ocean of green. It was here, at this junction between the familiar and the unknown, that the most recent sightings of Maracaboo had been reported. As the sun dipped below the horizon on that crisp autumn evening, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, I arrived at our designated meeting spot in the Picnic Point parking lot. The air was thick with the scent of eucalyptus and the distant cry of kookaburras, their laughter echoing through the gathering darkness like a warning we were too foolish to heed. Aiden, ever the punctual one, was already there when I pulled up, his car's headlights illuminating a small patch of the rapidly darkening lot. I found him rummaging through his trunk, meticulously organizing what appeared to be an extensive collection of survival gear. "You know we're only exploring the surrounding woods, right?" I called out, my tone laced with gentle mockery as I approached. "We're not embarking on a trek across the outback." Aiden turned to me, his face set in an expression of utmost seriousness. He pointed a stern finger in my direction, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen far too many survival documentaries. "Survival is no joke, Liam," he declared, returning to his task with renewed vigor. "You never know what might happen out there. Better to be prepared for anything than caught off guard." I left him to his preparations, shaking my head with a mixture of amusement and admiration for his thoroughness. As I waited for the others to arrive, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of excitement tinged with a subtle undercurrent of unease. The stories of Maracaboo, which had seemed so ridiculous in the light of day, now took on a more ominous tone as darkness settled over the landscape. A few minutes later, the headlights of another car swept across the parking lot, announcing the arrival of Kyle and Peter. They emerged from the vehicle, their faces a mix of excitement and nervous energy. "What up, ghost hunters?" Kyle called out, his voice carrying a forced bravado that didn't quite mask the tension underneath. "Who's ready to look for the Smiling Man and probably get eaten alive by mosquitoes instead?" We gathered around Aiden's car, going over our plan one last time as he distributed various pieces of equipment from his seemingly bottomless supply of survival gear. Flashlights were checked and double-checked, extra batteries distributed, and a basic first aid kit was packed into each of our backpacks. As Aiden ran through a final checklist that sounded more appropriate for a military operation than a night hike, I found myself growing impatient, eager to begin our adventure into the unknown. Finally, with everything in order, we set off down the main hiking trail, our path illuminated by the harsh beams of our flashlights. The forest seemed to close in around us as we descended, the familiar sounds of the Australian bush at night taking on a more sinister tone in the context of our mission. Every rustle in the underbrush, every snap of a twig underfoot, sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. We had been walking for nearly an hour, following the winding trail deeper into the forest, when the initial excitement began to wane, replaced by a growing sense of futility. The woods, which had seemed so full of potential and mystery at the outset of our journey, now felt oppressively ordinary. "Maybe we should just go home," Aiden suggested, his voice tinged with a mixture of disappointment and relief as he paused to apply yet another layer of bug spray to his arms. The pungent odor of insect repellent mixed with the earthy scent of the forest, creating an odd chemical tang in the air. I was about to reluctantly agree when a sudden rustling in the undergrowth ahead caught my attention. My heart leapt into my throat as I swung my flashlight beam towards the source of the noise. Something darted away from the light, scampering up a nearby tree with surprising agility. I gestured frantically to my friends, directing their attention to the tree where my beam was now focused. We watched in tense silence as something moved among the branches, partially obscured by the dense foliage. After a moment that felt like an eternity, a possum emerged from the leaves, its eyes reflecting our flashlight beams like tiny, accusing mirrors. A collective sigh of relief echoed through our group, nervous laughter following close behind. It was in that moment of shared relief, as we began to relax and contemplate turning back, that everything changed. Without warning, something burst through the bushes directly in front of us, moving with a speed and purpose that was unmistakably predatory. The suddenness of its appearance startled me so badly that I dropped my flashlight, plunging my immediate surroundings into darkness. Panic gripped me as I fumbled in the leaf litter, desperately searching for my light source. My fingers closed around the cold metal of the flashlight, and I quickly raised it, illuminating the figure that stood before us. What I saw in that moment will haunt me for the rest of my days. It looked like a man, but there was something profoundly wrong about its proportions. The limbs were too long, too thin, like the branches of a tree that had grown in darkness, stretching desperately towards an unseen light. The arms, in particular, were grotesquely elongated, hanging well past where knees should have been, ending in hands with fingers that seemed more like talons. But it was the face that truly seared itself into my memory. The skin was pallid, almost luminescent in the harsh beam of my flashlight. It stretched too tightly over the facial features, as if it had been shrink-wrapped onto a skull, emphasizing every contour and angle in a way that was deeply unsettling. The eyes were impossibly large, dark pools that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. And the smile. God, that smile. It stretched from ear to ear, literally splitting the face in a rictus grin that exposed far too many teeth, each one gleaming wickedly in the artificial light. For what felt like an eternity, we stood frozen, locked in a tableau of terror as we stared at the creature, and it stared back at us. In that moment, I felt as if I was looking into the face of something that should not exist, something that defied the natural order of the world as I understood it. My mind reeled, unable to process what my eyes were seeing. With trembling hands, I reached for my phone, driven by some insane desire to document this impossible encounter. But as my fingers closed around the device, the spell was broken. The creature moved, and the world exploded into chaos, It broke into a sprint, covering the distance between us with inhuman speed. The sight of that grotesque figure bearing down on us, its unnaturally wide grin never faltering, shattered any remaining doubt or disbelief. This was Maracaibo, the smiling man, and he was terrifyingly, undeniably real. Instinct took over. I ran. We all did, our bodies responding to the primal urge to flee before our minds could even process what was happening. I don't think I've ever run so fast in my life. The forest that had seemed so benign just moments ago was now a gauntlet of obstacles. Branches whipped against my face and arms, leaving stinging welts in their wake. Roots threatened to trip me with every step, and the uneven ground made each footfall a gamble. The sound of my own ragged breathing and pounding heart filled my ears, punctuated by the crashing of my friends as they fled alongside me. I could hear Aiden's voice, a steady stream of "No, no, no, no," that suddenly cut off, replaced by a strangled cry that was quickly swallowed by the night. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Every fiber of my being was focused on escape, on putting as much distance between myself and that nightmare creature as possible. Time lost all meaning as we ran, the forest blurring into a dark tunnel with the vague promise of safety at its end. When we finally burst out of the tree line and into the relative safety of the parking lot, it felt like we had been running for hours. My lungs burned with every breath, and my legs trembled, threatening to give out at any moment. We staggered to our cars, finally daring to look back at the dark mass of trees we had just emerged from. Nothing followed us out of the woods. The forest stood silent and still, betraying no sign of the horror we had just witnessed. As the immediate threat receded, a new, terrible realization began to dawn on me. "Are you guys all right?" I managed to gasp out between heaving breaths, my eyes scanning our small group. It was Peter who voiced the question that was just beginning to form in my mind. "Where's Aiden?" The bottom dropped out of my stomach as I realized that our friend was not with us. The memory of his voice, abruptly silenced in the chaos of our flight, replayed in my mind with sickening clarity. "We have to go find him," Kyle said, his face pale and drawn in the harsh glare of the parking lot lights. I'm ashamed to admit that I didn't join the search. Fear had its claws too deeply embedded in me, and the thought of venturing back into those woods filled me with a paralyzing dread. Kyle and Peter, braver than I, made it as far as the trailhead, calling Aiden's name into the darkness. But the forest remained silent, offering no response to their increasingly desperate cries. After an hour of fruitless searching and repeated attempts to call Aiden's phone, which went straight to voicemail each time, we finally made the call to the police. They arrived quickly, their flashing lights and official presence bringing a small measure of comfort to our shattered nerves. The officers took our initial statements there in the parking lot, their faces a mixture of concern and skepticism as we recounted our encounter. I could see the doubt in their eyes, the unspoken assumption that this was some sort of prank gone wrong, or the result of overzealous imagination fueled by local legends. We were taken down to the station for more formal interviews, separated and questioned individually. I told my story again and again, each retelling making it sound more unbelievable to my own ears. How could I expect them to believe in Maracaibo when I was still struggling to believe it myself? As dawn broke, painting the sky in soft pinks and golds that seemed obscenely cheerful given the circumstances, we were finally released. The police assured us that search parties were combing the woods for any sign of Aiden, but their tone held little hope. Sleep eluded me that night, and indeed for many nights after. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that impossible smile, those elongated limbs reaching for me from the darkness. The guilt weighed heavily on me, a constant reminder that it was my idea to go looking for the smiling man, my foolish desire for a thrill that had led to Aiden's disappearance. In the days that followed, I called the police station regularly, desperate for any news. But each call brought the same response. No trace of Aiden had been found. The woods had swallowed him completely, leaving no clue as to his fate. The story of our encounter spread quickly through Toowoomba, reviving the legend of Maracaibo with renewed vigor. Some believed us, their own half-forgotten encounters with the unexplainable lending credence to our tale. Others dismissed it as a hoax or the product of overactive imaginations, unable or unwilling to accept the implications of what we had seen. As for me, I find myself caught between two worlds. The rational part of my mind struggles to reconcile what I experienced with what I know to be possible, while another part, awakened that night in the forest, remains ever vigilant for a glimpse of that terrible smile in the shadows. I don't venture into the woods anymore. The once comforting embrace of nature now feels threatening, hiding untold horrors just beyond the reach of civilization. But sometimes, on dark nights when the wind whispers through the trees, I find myself drawn to my window, staring out at the forest that encircles our town. And I wonder, with a mixture of dread and terrible curiosity, if somewhere out there, Maracaibo is smiling back. Makaketa Cave State Park stands as one of Iowa's most impressive natural wonders, spanning an impressive 370 acres of rugged terrain and hidden mysteries. The park's crown jewel is its intricate network of hiking trails, stretching 6 miles through the wilderness and connecting 13 distinct caves that have drawn visitors for generations. While most know the park for its breathtaking natural beauty and opportunities for family adventure, few can now separate it from the horrifying events that unfolded there in July 2022. The murders that occurred within its boundaries remain some of the most perplexing and heartbreaking in recent Iowa history, leaving a community shattered and countless questions unanswered. While state officials don't technically classify the Makaketa Cave State Park murders as unsolved, many aspects of the case feel frustratingly incomplete. Critical information remains sealed from public view, details that might help make sense of the senseless violence that claimed 3 innocent lives. The story becomes even more complex when considering the fate of the alleged killer, whose death only deepened the mystery surrounding these tragic events. The question that continues to haunt investigators, family members, and the public alike is simply, why? What drove someone to commit such a horrific act against a sleeping family? To understand the full scope of this tragedy, we must first introduce the Schmid family, whose lives were forever altered that summer night. Originally from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, located about 60 miles west of Makaketa Cave State Park, the Schmids represented the quintessential Midwestern family. Tyler Schmid had built a successful career as an IT software engineer in Lawrence, Kansas, before relocating his family to Iowa in 2018. His wife, Sarah Schmid, found her calling working at the Cedar Falls Public Library, where she shared her love of books and learning with the community. Their love story began in an almost storybook fashion when fate brought them together during a monarch butterfly project. The connection was immediate, as they discovered their shared passion for nature and their mutual devotion to the Kansas Jayhawks. This chance meeting blossomed into romance, marriage, and eventually, the joy of parenthood with their 2 children, 6-year-old Lula and 9-year-old Arlo. In July 2022, the Schmid family embarked on what should have been another memorable outdoor adventure, something they had done countless times before. They chose Makaketa Cave State Park for its natural beauty and family-friendly atmosphere. No one could have predicted that this vacation would end in unimaginable tragedy. The horror began to unfold on July 22nd, when what should have been a peaceful night of camping turned into a nightmare. The attack was brutally unprovoked, leaving young Arlo Schmid as the sole survivor of his immediate family. When news of the case first broke, Arlo's location during the murders wasn't initially disclosed to the public. However, authorities and Arlo himself would later confirm the horrifying truth. He had been inside the tent with his family when the attack began. The early morning hours of July 22nd brought terror to the quiet campground. 9-year-old Arlo Schmidt awoke to the sounds of his family being attacked in their tent. In the darkness, chaos erupted. Screaming filled the air, blood was spilled, and the young boy realized his parents were being severely injured. In a moment of extraordinary courage and survival instinct, Arlo, wearing only one shoe, fled through the darkness. He ran 75 yards across the dewy grass to the nearest campsite, desperately screaming for help. That closest campsite belonged to the Sherwin family, Cecilia, her husband, and their son, who were about to become inextricably linked to this tragedy. Cecilia Sherwin would later recall hearing blood-curdling screams, followed by 2 distinct gunshots that shattered the pre-dawn silence. As they investigated the commotion, a terrified young boy ran toward them, crying out that something terrible had happened to his parents. He reported seeing a man in black who had shot his family. The contents of the 911 call remained unknown to the public for several months until January 2023, when it was released through the Freedom of Information Act. The recording begins with Cecilia Sherwin's urgent cry of "shooting, shooting," as she attempted to explain the situation to the dispatcher. In the background, Arlo's voice can be heard, his words carrying the weight of unimaginable trauma. "I don't know if they were shot, but it was scary." The call continues with mounting tension as the dispatcher tries to gather information. "Jackson County 911, where's your emergency?" Cecilia responds with increasing panic. "Marker kids of caves." The confusion and fear are palpable in every word exchanged. As the 911 call progressed, the dispatcher contacted park rangers before returning her attention to Cecilia. In an attempt to gather more detailed information, the dispatcher asked to speak directly with Arlo. The young boy's account was chilling in its clarity. "I woke up and saw someone in black clothes. They had a weapon and my sister was screaming." When asked about his father's whereabouts, Arlo's response came after a haunting pause. "I think they were hurt." The recording reveals a particularly puzzling segment where Cecilia's words become unclear due to poor reception. Through the static, she can be heard saying something that would later raise questions. "He, Arlo, was screaming up there in the tent, and we heard shots," followed by unintelligible portions. She continues, "He was screaming up there in the tent, but nobody would come out. Nobody would come out, and so we, towards the entrance, and so we, him away." These fragmentary statements raised red flags for investigators and the public alike. A crucial question emerged. Did Arlo run to the Sherwins' campsite on his own? Or did the Sherwins, possibly Cecilia, approach the Schmidt tent and remove him from the scene? The discrepancy between these two scenarios would become just one of many puzzling elements in this case. Approximately 23 minutes after the 911 call began, a park ranger arrived at the scene. The accounts provided by both Arlo and Cecilia aligned on certain points. They both reported hearing gunshots, and Cecilia confirmed to police and reporters that she heard yelling followed by 2 gunshots just before Arlo appeared at their campsite. However, the inconsistencies in her initial phone statement versus later accounts would add another layer of mystery to the case. When authorities reached the scene about 25 minutes after receiving the 911 call, they discovered a horrific tableau. Inside the tent lay the bodies of Tyler and Sarah Smid, both 42 years old, and their 6-year-old daughter Lula. The family from Cedar Falls, Iowa, had been brutally attacked in their sleep. The response was swift and comprehensive. Park authorities immediately closed the grounds and evacuated nearby Camp Shalom, a children's camp, until further notice. As police worked to verify the whereabouts of all registered campers, one person remained conspicuously absent. 23-year-old Anthony Sherwin, the son of the woman who had made the 911 call. Hours into the search, approximately a mile from the murder scene, searchers made another grim discovery: Anthony Sherwin's body. He had apparently died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. In the investigation's early hours, Cecilia and her husband were unaware of their son's death or that he was the primary suspect police were searching for. It wasn't until August 4th that Mitch Mordved, assistant director with the Iowa Department of Safety, released a statement confirming their worst fears. The known facts and circumstances and all evidence collected to this point substantiate that Sherwin was the perpetrator of the homicides and acted alone. The seemingly random nature of the attack bewildered investigators and family members alike. Sarah Schmidt's brother, Adam Morehouse, emphasized this point in his statement to Quad Cities Media. "All we know is that this was completely random. Nobody in either's family knew anybody. We didn't know the suspect didn't know us. We don't know of any interaction that occurred. It was simply, this individual woke up that morning and decided to pick a tent, walk into that tent where my sister and her family were sleeping, and they never even got the chance to wake up." The autopsies, performed in the days following the murders, revealed the brutal nature of the attack. Tyler had suffered both stab wounds and gunshot wounds, while Sarah had been killed by stab wounds alone. Most horrifically, 6-year-old Lula had been both strangled and shot. The varying methods of violence used would later raise questions about the killer's state of mind and possible motives. Anthony Orlando Sherwin, age 23, lived in La Vista, Nebraska, sharing an apartment complex with his parents, Cecilia and Joe Sherwin. The family had been enjoying an extended camping trip, arriving at Maquoketa Cave State Park on Thursday, July 21st. Following standard camping protocol, they set up 2 tents, one for the parents and a separate one for Anthony. In the aftermath of their son's death, Cecilia Sherwin spoke to the Omaha World Herald, expressing their complete disbelief at the accusations against Anthony. Despite police reports, the Sherwins maintained their son's innocence, insisting he too was a victim of homicide. They emphasized that Anthony had shown no signs of distress or any indication he might harm others or himself. The investigation took an intriguing turn when sources revealed to the Des Moines Register that Sherwin had allegedly used a ghost gun in both the shootings and his suicide. Ghost guns, as defined by CBS News, are unregistered and untraceable homemade weapons that can be manufactured using a 3D printer or assembled from kits. The ATF had identified these weapons as a growing concern, with their average price around $500 as of April 2022. The Sherwin family had initially informed police about bringing a legal concealed weapon on their trip, complete with proper permits. However, this weapon was discovered missing when authorities arrived. Police concluded that Anthony had removed the gun from its secure case before heading to the neighboring campsite. In a subsequent email to the Des Moines Register, his parents revealed that Anthony had built his own weapon. They explained their seemingly contradictory stance. While they had opposed him purchasing a gun, they considered building one sensible given crime levels near their Nebraska home. His mother stated, "He only had an interest in guns for a few months before he grew tired of it. By the time we even took our trip, he told us he was going to get rid of them. We were relieved as we never owned a gun of any kind before this year. He didn't have a fascination as much as it was a challenge to build it." The case became more complex as alternative narratives emerged. Cecilia insisted her son had been wearing green, not black as Arlo had described, stating she had personally distributed the family's clean clothes the day before the shooting. The autopsy report, obtained independently, confirmed Anthony was wearing green clothing, creating a discrepancy with Arlo's account of a man in black. However, given the darkness and trauma of the moment, such a discrepancy could be explained by the conditions and circumstances. Another significant contradiction arose regarding Anthony's death. While early reports indicated a single gunshot wound to the head, Cecilia maintained her son had sustained 2 gunshot wounds. This detail raised questions about how he could have managed to fire a second shot after an initially debilitating wound. The Sherwin family's most pressing question remained unanswered. whether ballistics matched between the gun used on the Schmitz and the one that ended Anthony's life. Despite their inquiries to lead investigators, no answer was provided. Public record requests filed in 2023 by the Quad City Times under Iowa's Open Records Law and the Freedom of Information Act were denied. These requests had sought incident reports, investigative documents, crime scene summaries, and autopsy reports. Debbie McClung, Strategic Communications Bureau Chief for the Iowa Department of Public Safety, maintained that these records were not public, offering only press release links as available information. When directly questioned about ballistics matching between the weapons, officials remained silent. Assistant Director Mordvet had mentioned investigators knew of a possible motive but would not release it publicly. No additional information has been released since August 4, 2022. The case leaves many questions unanswered. Was Anthony definitively the killer? What evidence exists to prove or disprove his involvement? If not Anthony, who was the man in black? Why are authorities withholding certain information, even from the deceased's families? What was Cecilia really trying to say in that partially unintelligible 911 call? The police maintain their evidence points to Anthony as the sole perpetrator. This raises further questions about his intentions and whether he anticipated the family waking up during his attack. The mix of violence methods, shooting, stabbing, and strangulation, suggests a complex and disturbing scenario that defies simple explanation. Cedar Falls Mayor Rob Green, who knew the Schmitz as both a friend and neighbor, delivered an emotional tribute at a memorial service in the city park. More than 200 people gathered to remember the family, with framed photos of the Schmitz displayed before the podium. The ceremony served as a powerful reminder of the community's loss and resilience. Today, Arlo Schmidt lives with extended family, surrounded by love and support. His cousin, Beth Shapiro, established a GoFundMe campaign that initially raised $40,000 to assist with his future. The fund has since grown to over $293,000, all dedicated to supporting Arlo's education and future needs. The Makaketa Cave State Park murders remain a haunting reminder that sometimes the human psyche defies understanding. While the case may be officially closed, the questions it raises about random violence, family tragedy, and the limits of public information continue to resonate with all who encounter this story. It was mid-September when my family and I decided to try boondock camping, a decision that would forever change how we viewed the seemingly peaceful forests of Indiana. The autumn colors were just beginning to emerge, painting the landscape in subtle hues of amber and crimson, creating a deceptively serene backdrop for what would become the most terrifying experience of our lives. The air was crisp with the promise of the coming fall, carrying with it the earthy scent of decaying leaves and the last whispers of summer's warmth. For those unfamiliar, boondocking means camping in the middle of nowhere, with no electricity or running water, just us and nature in its rawest form. The concept had always intrigued my father, a former Boy Scout leader who believed in teaching his children the importance of self-reliance and wilderness survival. His eyes had lit up with excitement when he first proposed the idea, regaling us with tales of his own youth spent exploring the untamed wilderness. We spent weeks preparing for the trip, meticulously planning every detail. Our family's trusted four-season tent, a sturdy haven that had sheltered us through countless milder camping trips, was carefully inspected and waterproofed. We invested in new sleeping bags rated for the crisp Indiana nights, their down filling promising warmth, even as temperatures dipped towards freezing. Our food supplies were a carefully curated mix of lightweight, high-energy options, freeze-dried meals, energy bars, and my mother's homemade trail mix, packed with nuts and dried fruits. Multiple forms of emergency communication devices were checked and double-checked: satellite phones, emergency beacons, and good old-fashioned maps and compasses. My father, ever the pragmatist, insisted on redundancy in all our crucial gear. Nature doesn't care about your plans, he'd often say, a mantra that would echo ominously in the days to come. Our destination was the Yellowwood State Forest, barely 2 hours from our comfortable suburban home in Indianapolis, yet worlds away from civilization as we knew it. The drive there was filled with a mix of excitement and nervous energy. My younger sister Lily, 13 and full of endless enthusiasm despite her initial reservations about the trip, chattered incessantly about the wildlife we might see. I, at 16, affected an air of cool indifference, though secretly I shared her excitement. Our German shepherd Duke, a highly trained former police dog my father had adopted 3 years ago, sat alertly in the back, his ears perking up at every new sound as we left the familiar cityscape behind and ventured into increasingly rural territory. As we drove deeper into the forest, the paved roads gave way to gravel, then to rutted dirt tracks that tested our SUV's suspension. The trees grew denser, their branches forming a canopy overhead that filtered the sunlight into a dappled pattern on the forest floor. The air grew noticeably cooler and damper as we penetrated further into the heart of Yellowwood. An inexplicable sense of unease began to settle over me, a feeling I initially dismissed as simple nervousness about the unfamiliar environment. We arrived at our chosen spot late in the afternoon, deep within the forest where the dirt road had long since given way to barely visible tire tracks. The clearing we selected seemed to have been carved out of the wilderness by nature itself, a perfect circle surrounded by towering oaks and maples. The late afternoon sun filtered through the canopy above, creating shifting shadows that danced across our campsite as we worked to set up our temporary home. As my parents began to unpack the car and set up the tent, Lily, Duke, and I volunteered to gather firewood. We set off into the forest, our boots crunching satisfyingly on the carpet of fallen leaves. The forest was alive with sound. Birds calling to each other in the branches overhead, small animals rustling in the underbrush, the distant gurgle of a stream. Lily and I chatted and laughed, sharing stories about school and our friends, our voices echoing slightly in the vastness of the forest. Suddenly, we heard what sounded like slow, deliberate footsteps behind us. Not the random rustle of wildlife, but the measured pace of something large and purposeful. The sound was unmistakably bipedal, each step carefully placed, as if whatever was making the noise was trying to move quietly but couldn't quite manage it. We spun around, our hearts pounding in unified terror, but saw nothing except the endless rows of trees stretching into the gathering dusk. The laughter died in our throats, replaced by a cold dread that seemed to seep into our very bones. Duke's reaction was immediate and alarming. His fur stood on end, his muscles tensed beneath his thick coat, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. In all our years with him, I had never seen him display such a combination of aggression and fear. This was a dog who had faced down armed criminals without flinching, yet now he trembled as he stared into the seemingly empty forest. I knelt down, trying to calm him, my hands shaking as I stroked his bristling fur. "It's just a squirrel, boy," I said, more to reassure myself and Lily than Duke, whose training and instincts I had learned to trust implicitly. Deep down, I knew it wasn't a squirrel. No squirrel had ever elicited such a response from our normally unflappable companion. We hurried back to the campsite, our arms laden with hastily gathered wood, our eyes darting nervously at every shadow. We didn't mention the incident to our parents, not wanting to worry them or appear childish, but as the day wore on and darkness began to fall, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something out there in the vastness of the forest was aware of our presence and waiting. Night fell quickly, as it often does in the forest, the darkness seeming to seep up from the ground rather than descend from above. We were all in the tent, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy by playing cards by lantern light, listening to music on a portable speaker, and joking around as if we were simply camping in our backyard. The thin nylon walls of the tent seemed a pitifully inadequate barrier against the vast, dark wilderness outside. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves seemed magnified in the stillness of the night, setting our nerves on edge. Mom and Lily fell asleep early, exhausted from the day's activities, and lulled by the gentle chorus of crickets and distant owls. This left just Dad and me awake, sitting near the tent's entrance and speaking in hushed tones about his own camping experiences as a young man. The stories were meant to be comforting, tales of adventure and self-discovery in the wilderness, but they only served to highlight how isolated we were, how far from help if anything were to go wrong. That's when we heard it. A woman's scream that seemed to tear through the fabric of the night itself, filled with such pure agony that it made my blood run cold. It wasn't the sound of someone startled or frightened. It was the sound of someone being subjected to unimaginable torture, a sound that seemed to carry with it all the darkness and evil that humans are capable of inflicting upon one another. The scream went on, rising and falling in pitch, sometimes breaking into sobs, sometimes escalating into shrieks of pain that seemed to pierce right through to my soul. Dad and I rushed out of the tent, our hearts pounding so hard I could feel my pulse in my throat. The beam of our flashlights cut through the darkness like knives, but revealed nothing except trees and undergrowth, their shadows seeming to shift and dance mockingly just beyond the reach of our lights. We called out, offering help, but our voices seemed swallowed up by the vastness of the forest, even as the screams continued to echo around us. We scanned the area methodically, as Dad had taught me to do during our hunting trips, but found no signs of disturbance, no footprints, no broken branches, nothing to indicate that anyone or anything had passed through the area. The screaming had stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. We tried to convince ourselves it must have been a panther or bobcat, though neither of us truly believed it. The sound had been too human, too filled with conscious suffering to have come from any animal we knew. We returned to the tent, staying awake to keep watch, our bodies tense and our nerves frayed. Mom and Lily slept on, seemingly undisturbed by the horrific sounds, which only added to the surreal nature of the experience. About an hour later, we heard the scream again, this time so close it seemed to originate from just inches beyond the thin nylon wall of our tent. Before we could process this, the sound moved to the other side of the tent, and then behind us, covering distances that should have been impossible in the span of seconds. Whatever was producing these sounds was moving far too quickly to be human or animal, defying the basic laws of physics that governed our understanding of the world. Dad grabbed his rifle, checking it with trembling hands that betrayed his fear despite years of military training, and I clutched my hunting knife, its familiar weight providing little comfort against the unknown threat that lurked in the darkness. Duke came with us, his hackles raised and his teeth bared in a silent snarl that spoke volumes about the danger he sensed. We saw nothing in the encompassing darkness, but the air felt thick with tension, almost electric, and an eerie silence had fallen over the forest. No crickets, no owls, not even the whisper of wind through the trees. The world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Dad cocked his rifle, the sound echoing unnaturally loud in the stillness, more to scare away potential threats than anything else, though we both knew that whatever was out there wasn't likely to be deterred by conventional weapons. We stood back to back, scanning the darkness, every sense straining for any sign of danger. The minutes stretched on, feeling like hours, but nothing happened. No more screams, no movement, just the oppressive silence and the feeling of malevolent eyes watching us from every direction. Back in the tent, we found Lily wide awake, her face pale and drawn with terror in the dim light of our lantern. She said she'd heard whispering right behind her, which seemed impossible given she was inside the tent, pressed against the back wall. The whispers, she said, had been in a language she didn't recognize, but they had carried a tone of malevolent glee that made her feel physically ill. I tried to comfort her, wrapping her in my sleeping bag and holding her close, but I was just as scared, my mind racing with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. None of us slept that night. We sat huddled together in the center of the tent, weapons at the ready, jumping at every sound real or imagined. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness, each minute stretching into an eternity of fear and anticipation. When the first light of dawn finally began to filter through the trees, it felt like a physical weight had been lifted from us. We emerged from the tent, blinking in the pale morning light, our bodies stiff and our minds foggy from the sleepless night. In the harsh light of day, it was tempting to dismiss the events of the night as some sort of shared hallucination, a product of overactive imaginations and the unfamiliar environment. But the haunted look in my father's eyes, the way my mother's hands shook as she prepared breakfast, and the unnatural silence of my usually chatty sister, all spoke to the reality of what we had experienced. We spent the morning in tense silence, going through the motions of normal camping activities, but always with one eye on the surrounding forest. The decision to move our campsite was unanimous and unspoken. We packed up quickly, leaving behind the clearing that now seemed more like a trap than a haven. We found a new spot closer to other campers, hoping for safety in numbers. The new location was near a group of experienced-looking hunters, their presence providing a false sense of security that would prove woefully inadequate. As we set up our tent again, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were making a mistake, that we should be fleeing the forest entirely, rather than simply changing locations within it. That night was even worse than the first. While our parents were on a short walk to gather more firewood, none of us wanting to venture out alone anymore. Lily and I heard that bone-chilling whisper again, right beside the tent. The sound seemed to come from exactly at ear level, as if someone, or something, was crouching next to us, its mouth pressed against the tent fabric. The whispers were clearer this time, a string of sibilant sounds that seemed to slither through the air, carrying meaning without words, filling our minds with images of darkness and decay. Before we could react, an ear-splitting scream erupted from just outside, as if someone was being murdered right next to us. The sound was so close and so intense that it physically hurt our ears. Yet when we looked outside, the nearby campers showed no reaction, as if they hadn't heard anything at all. They continued their quiet conversations around their campfire, seemingly oblivious to the horrific sounds that had us paralyzed with fear. We stayed awake until dawn, huddled together in the center of the tent, weapons at the ready, though we all knew they would be useless against whatever was tormenting us. The night was filled with more whispers, screams, and sounds that defied description. Scratching at the tent walls, heavy breathing that seemed to come from all around us, and at one point what sounded like hundreds of fingers tapping rapidly on the roof of the tent. As soon as the first light of day began to filter through the trees, we packed up and left as quickly as we could, leaving behind several pieces of camping equipment in our haste to escape. The drive home was silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts, trying to process what we had experienced. To this day, we don't know what was in that forest, but we're certain it wasn't any animal we know of. The experience changed us all. Dad sold most of his camping gear, Mom refuses to discuss what happened, and Lily still has nightmares about those whispers. One thing's for sure, we'll never go back to Yellowwood State Forest again. Some mysteries, I've learned, are better left unsolved, some places better left unexplored, and some corners of our world better left in darkness. The wilderness, we discovered, holds more than just natural wonders and peaceful solitude. It holds secrets, ancient and malevolent, that are best left undisturbed. And sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't what you can see, but what remains hidden, whispering in the darkness, just beyond the reach of your campfire's light. I never thought I'd be sharing this story. Even now my hands shake as I type these words, remembering that summer morning in the Blue Ridge Mountains. But I need to tell someone, to make sense of what happened, what we all saw. I've been hiking these mountains since I could walk. My father, a former park ranger, instilled in me a deep love for the outdoors from an early age. Every weekend, we'd pack our gear and head into the wilderness, following deer trails and discovering hidden waterfalls. The mountains became my second home, a place where I felt truly alive. After college, I started leading hiking groups through the local outdoor club. That's where I met Sarah and Mike, who would become my closest friends. Sarah was a wildlife photographer with an eye for detail that bordered on obsessive, while Mike worked as a geologist. We were the perfect trio, Sarah documenting our adventures, Mike explaining the ancient history written in the rocks, and me leading the way through the wilderness I knew like the back of my hand. We spent countless weekends exploring the lesser-known trails of the Blue Ridge Mountains, sharing stories around campfires, and building the kind of friendship that only comes from facing nature's challenges together. We'd seen our share of strange things, unexplained lights in the distance, odd tracks in the mud, and sounds that didn't quite fit any known animal. But we always found logical explanations, or at least we did until that day. It started with a rumor. Mike had heard stories from the local Cherokee about an ancient trail that supposedly led to a sacred site deep in the mountains. According to legend, the site was protected by spirits that could take any form they wished. We'd heard similar stories before. Every small town has its myths, but something about this one felt different. Sarah spent weeks researching, digging through historical records and old maps in the county library. She found references to the trail in journals dating back to the 1800s, each account more disturbing than the last. Settlers wrote about shape-shifting creatures and beings that walked like men but weren't men. We dismissed these as superstition, the product of isolated mountain communities and overactive imaginations. I meticulously planned our route, cross-referencing modern topographical maps with Sarah's historical findings. The trail seemed to follow an old creek bed before disappearing into one of the most remote sections of the mountains. We'd need 3 days to explore it properly. Our preparation was thorough. We packed extra supplies, emergency beacons, and satellite phones. Mike brought his geological survey equipment, hoping to document any unusual formations. Sarah packed her best cameras, including infrared gear for night photography. I remember checking our gear 3 times, an unusual anxiety gnawing at the edges of my consciousness. The morning we set out was perfect. Crisp mountain air, clear skies, and a gentle breeze rustling through the trees. The first few miles followed established trails, winding through dense forests of oak and hickory. The familiar sounds of woodpeckers and warbling vireos filled the air, but something felt off. The usual squirrels and chipmunks were nowhere to be seen. Sarah noticed it first. "It's too quiet," she said, stopping to photograph a patch of unusual fungi growing on a fallen log. The mushrooms seemed to pulse slightly, but when we looked closer, they appeared normal. Mike took samples, noting their location for later research. As we ventured further from the marked trails, the forest began to change. The trees grew older, their trunks twisted into impossible shapes. Moss hung in thick curtains, creating an eerie twilight even in mid-afternoon. Our conversations grew shorter, more hushed, as if the forest itself was listening. By evening we made camp near a small stream. The water ran clear but seemed to whisper as it flowed over the rocks. Sarah set up her night cameras while Mike took soil samples. I tried to shake off the growing sense of unease as I prepared dinner, but the silence of the forest pressed in around us like a physical presence. The first sign that something was wrong came at dawn. Sarah's cameras had captured something during the night, strange lights moving through the trees, too organized to be fireflies, too erratic to be flashlights. But it was what we found by the stream that truly chilled us. The rocks where we'd collected water the night before were arranged in a perfect circle, each stone balanced on its end. None of us had done it, and the morning dew suggested they'd been placed hours ago. Mike studied them with professional interest, noting that several of the rocks weren't native to the area. Following the stream led us to a small clearing we hadn't noticed the day before. The ground was bare except for a spiral pattern of those same mushrooms we'd seen earlier, their caps now a deep, unnatural purple. In the center lay a small animal, possibly a possum, its white fur matted and arranged in an unnaturally symmetrical pattern. Despite every instinct screaming at us to turn back, we pressed on. The trail led us deeper into increasingly bizarre territory. The trees began to show signs of impossible grafting. Different species merged together in ways that defied natural law. Mike collected bark samples, his hands shaking slightly as he worked. Sarah's compass started spinning wildly, and our GPS devices showed coordinates that kept changing, sometimes placing us hundreds of miles from our actual location. The air grew thick with an odd metallic smell, and sounds began to echo strangely, as if bouncing off walls that weren't there. We found more circles of stones, each larger than the last, forming a path deeper into the mountains. Between them, we discovered small bundles of white fur, perfectly arranged and tied with what looked like human hair. Sarah photographed everything, though later we'd find that many of the images were distorted or completely black. It happened so fast. One moment we were examining another stone circle, and the next, that small white-furred creature, like the one we'd seen dead earlier, appeared at the edge of our clearing. Before anyone could speak, it began to change. The transformation was impossible, yet we all saw it. The creature's form rippled like water, expanding and contorting until it stood nearly as tall as a person. Its new form was a nightmare amalgamation, the legs of a kangaroo, the tail of a rat, but with human-like hands tipped with obsidian claws. Its head resembled a greyhound's but was adorned with dreadlocks that seemed to move on their own, and its eyes glowed like hot coals. The creature moved with impossible speed, circling our group in bounds that defied physics. Its movements were fluid yet jerky, as if it existed in more dimensions than we could perceive. When it smiled, God help me, it smiled. Rows of pearl-white teeth gleamed in its black face. The chase was a blur of panic and adrenaline. We ran, abandoning most of our gear, crashing through underbrush and over rocks. The creature followed, always just at the edge of our vision, sometimes appearing ahead of us, sometimes behind, as if it was toying with us. Sarah fell and sprained her ankle. Mike and I carried her between us, our lungs burning as we fled. The creature's laughter, a sound like breaking glass mixed with a child's giggle, echoed through the trees. When we finally broke through to a marked trail, it stopped following us, but we didn't stop running until we reached the ranger station. The physical injuries healed quickly. Sarah's sprained ankle, our cuts and bruises from the frantic escape. The psychological wounds ran deeper. None of us slept well for months. The sound of rustling leaves could send us into panic attacks. Mike threw himself into analyzing the few samples we'd managed to keep, but the results only raised more questions. The bark samples showed impossible genetic combinations. The soil from near the stone circles contained trace elements that shouldn't exist in nature. Sarah's surviving photographs revealed distortions that even professional analysts couldn't explain. The more we investigated, the less sense anything made. Over the next year, we heard similar stories from other hikers in the region. Reports of a shape-shifting creature matching our description began to surface, always in remote areas, always near ancient stone circles. Local Cherokee elders listened to our story with knowing looks, but would say little except that some places should be left alone. We started finding small circles of stones near our homes, always in the early morning hours. White fur would appear on our windowsills during full moons. Sarah's motion-activated cameras captured glimpses of something moving in her garden at night. something that seemed to shift between forms. 5 years have passed since our encounter, and I still lead hiking groups, but never in that part of the mountains. Sarah moved to the city, unable to cope with the constant reminder of what we'd seen. Mike continues his research, though his colleagues think he's chasing fairy tales. The experience changed us fundamentally. We learned that the world is stranger and more terrifying than we could have imagined. The neat categories and explanations we use to make sense of reality are just comfortable lies we tell ourselves. Something walks in those mountains, something that breaks all our rules about what is and isn't possible. I still hike, still love the mountains, but I've learned to respect the old warnings, the places our ancestors marked as forbidden. There are things in this world that we're not meant to understand, creatures that exist in the margins between what we know and what we fear to know. Sometimes on quiet nights when the moon is full, I hear that glass-breaking laugh in the distance. And sometimes, just sometimes, I catch a glimpse of white fur transforming into something else entirely. I've always been drawn to the outdoors, but looking back now, I wonder if that same attraction to wilderness and solitude was what eventually led me into darkness. Growing up near the Wasatch Front, I spent countless weekends exploring Utah's diverse wilderness. My father taught me everything I know about surviving in the backcountry: how to read weather patterns, track animals, and most importantly, how to trust my instincts. If only I'd listened to those instincts that night in the Uintas. My passion for the outdoors shaped my entire life. I met my wife on a group hiking trip where we bonded over photography and plant identification. When we married, I gained not just a spouse but an entire family of outdoor enthusiasts. My father-in-law had been exploring the Uinta Mountains for decades, and my brothers-in-law shared my appetite for adventure. They had their secret spots throughout the range, places passed down through generations, each with its own story. Now I have my own story to add, though it's one I sometimes wish I could forget. The COVID lockdown hit us hard, coinciding with the birth of our first child. 2 years of being confined to city limits felt like a slow suffocation. I missed the mountains with a physical ache, like phantom limb pain. When restrictions finally eased, I jumped at the chance for a camping trip with my in-laws. I had a new Land Cruiser to test out, a fresh hammock setup, and that burning desire to reconnect with the wilderness. I never imagined that wilderness would reach back. The planning became almost obsessive. I spent hours studying topographical maps of the Uintas, noticing things I'd never paid attention to before: the strange gaps between trails, the areas marked as unexplored even on modern maps. My father-in-law's chosen spot was about 2.5 hours from the valley, in a region known for its unusual geological formations and inexplicable magnetic anomalies. I prepared meticulously, perhaps driven by some subconscious premonition. My new ENO hammock system came with a bug net and rainfly. I packed my sleeping bag rated for mountain temperatures, extra layers, emergency supplies, and my .45 70-lever action rifle. That rifle had seen me through encounters with bears and moose before. I never imagined I'd wish for something bigger. The modifications to my Land Cruiser went beyond simple maintenance. I installed larger tires, reinforced the suspension, and added extra lighting, the kind that could turn night into day. I remember joking with my wife about being overprepared. Now I wonder if some part of me knew what was coming. The day started perfectly, too perfectly looking back. Clear skies stretched overhead as we wound our way up into the mountains, watching civilization recede in our rearview mirrors. The forecast promised a full moon, and the recent snowmelt had left the trails challenging but passable. My Land Cruiser handled the terrain well, though the mud grabbed at our tires like hungry fingers. The secret spot revealed itself gradually, a clearing nestled among mature pines and aspens, hidden from the main trail by natural screening. At 65 degrees, the air carried that crisp mountain sweetness. But there was something else, a heaviness I couldn't quite place, like the air before a storm. We arranged our vehicles in a protective circle, an unconscious nod to wagon trains of old. I secured my hammock between my Land Cruiser's roof rack and a massive pine, setting it high enough that I needed to climb the vehicle to enter. The height would prove both blessing and curse later that night. The park ranger's visit was our first warning, though we were too blind to see it. He appeared just as dusk was settling, his white Silverado materializing out of the growing shadows. His manner was professional, but there was tension in his shoulders, a tightness around his eyes that spoke of hidden concerns. His story about a homeless man causing trouble at nearby camps seemed straightforward enough. But why would anyone choose to wander these remote mountains? Why would they target campers? The ranger's eyes kept drifting to the darkness beyond our camp, as if expecting to see something watching us. Then came my father-in-law's accident with the axe. The cut wasn't deep, but blood has a way of changing the atmosphere of a place. As he drove himself to town for stitches, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being stripped of protection, like pieces being removed from a chessboard. The full moon rose huge and hostile over the mountains. Its light transformed the forest, creating a monochromatic world of silver and shadow, where nothing was quite what it seemed. The increased visibility only served to emphasize the absolute darkness between the trees, like black holes in the fabric of reality. The first pine cone struck while I was drifting off to sleep. It hit my hammock with deliberate force, not the casual drop of natural fall. The second one targeted my back specifically, the impact carrying a message. I see you. I hear you. I know exactly where you are. The sounds began after that. Not the normal nighttime forest sounds I'd grown up with, but something subtly wrong. Branches breaking with too much rhythm to be random. Movement that followed patterns just complex enough to be intelligent. And underneath it all, a smell, musty and wild like wet fur and decay. I checked my brothers-in-law repeatedly, confirming they were asleep, their soft snoring a counterpoint to the growing wrongness around us. The moon cast their hammocks in silver relief, making them look like cocoons hung by some giant spider. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. My father-in-law's return should have been reassuring. Instead, his headlights caught something retreating into the woods, something that moved with liquid grace despite its size, something wearing what he thought was a ghillie suit, but couldn't have been. The way he described its movement made my skin crawl. Like a spider pretending to be human, he whispered, his face pale in the moonlight. That's when the screaming started. It came from the direction where the figure had disappeared, a sound that began as almost human, but stretched into something else, something that spoke of centuries of isolation and hunger. The sound echoed off the mountains, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The thing circled our camp. We could track its progress by the way branches snapped under its weight, by the way our vehicle's motion sensors triggered one by one, lights flicking on and off like a countdown. The darkness between the trees seemed to pulse with its presence. I raised my rifle, the familiar weight offering little comfort. The motion sensors on my Land Cruiser triggered again, but this time something was different. Through my scope, I caught a glimpse of what was watching us. In the infrared light of the vehicle's sensors, I saw eyes reflecting back, not at head height where they should be, but 10 feet up the trunk of a pine tree. The creature clung to the bark like a spider, its limbs too long, too numerous. When it moved, the movement was wrong, smooth but segmented, like watching a time-lapse of a plant growing, or a spider spinning a web. The ghillie suit wasn't a suit at all, but some kind of natural camouflage that shifted and rippled with its movements. What happened next exists in my memory as a series of frozen frames, like lightning strikes in the darkness. The creature dropping from the tree, the impossible speed of its movement, The way it flowed over and around obstacles rather than through them. The sound of my rifle firing, the report impossibly loud in the mountain air. Did I hit it? I think so. There was a sound, not quite a scream, not quite a hiss, and a smell like burning hair and ozone. It retreated, but not in fear. Looking back, I think it was simply finished studying us. Like a scientist concluding an experiment, it had seen enough. The ranger's reaction the next morning confirmed my worst fears. The color didn't just drain from his face. He aged 10 years in 10 seconds. When we mentioned the ghillie suit, he turned away, but not before I saw the recognition in his eyes. He knew what we'd encountered. More importantly, he knew it wasn't the first time. I've spent months researching since then. The Uintas have a history of disappearances dating back to the first settlers. Native American legends speak of shape-shifting creatures that stalk the high places. The region's proximity to Skinwalker Ranch suddenly seems less like coincidence and more like pattern. My father-in-law maintains his skepticism, but I've noticed he no longer camps in the high country. My brothers-in-law won't talk about that night at all. As for me, I still venture into the mountains, but never alone, never at night, and never without wondering about what really lives in those ancient peaks. The fear isn't of being watched anymore. It's the growing certainty that we've always been watched, that something ancient and patient has been studying us, learning our patterns, our weaknesses. Something that wears camouflage not made by human hands, that moves with a grace that speaks of endless practice, that screams with a voice that knows how to almost sound human. Sometimes on full moon nights, I look toward the mountains and wonder, how many others has it studied? How many others has it marked? And most troublingly, what happens when it decides it's learned enough? The next time you're in the wilderness and feel eyes upon you, remember this. Not all predators hunt for food. Some hunt for knowledge, some hunt for sport, and some, I fear, hunt simply because they've learned enough about us to find it amusing. Stay away from the high places after dark. And if you hear screaming in the mountains that sounds almost human, run. Run as fast as you can. Just don't expect it to make any difference. My obsession with survival skills started with a near-death experience in the Cascades when I was 16. A simple day hike turned dangerous when an unexpected storm rolled in, trapping me on an exposed ridge for 6 hours. I survived only because a search and rescue team happened to be training nearby. That brush with mortality changed something fundamental in me. After that, survival wasn't just a hobby, it became my life's focus. While my classmates decorated their rooms with band posters and sports memorabilia, my walls became a survival manual come to life. Topographical maps of every major wilderness area in Washington state. Equipment lists arranged by season and terrain type. Weather pattern charts. Animal tracking guides. I recorded every episode of Man vs. Wild, taking detailed notes on Bear Grylls techniques. But I wasn't content just watching. I practiced fire starting in my backyard until my hands blistered. I learned to identify every edible plant in the Pacific Northwest. I could tie 30 different knots blindfolded. My parents worried I was becoming obsessed, but I knew I was just getting started. The Boulder Outdoor Survival School represented the pinnacle of wilderness training. Located in southern Utah's unforgiving desert landscape, their 28-day field course promised to transform enthusiasts into genuine survivalists. When my parents combined my graduation and birthday presents to cover the tuition, I felt like I'd finally found my path. Those 28 days stripped away everything I thought I knew about survival and rebuilt my understanding from the ground up. We learned to read landscapes like books, to hear stories in broken twigs and disturbed soil. The instructors taught us how weather patterns affected animal behavior, how to predict flash floods hours in advance, how to find water in seemingly barren terrain. I lost 20 pounds but gained something far more valuable: genuine confidence born from hard-earned experience. By the end of the course, I could start a fire in pouring rain, construct a shelter in under 30 minutes, and track animals across bare rock. I came home changed, seeing the wilderness not as an adversary, but as a complex system I could navigate and understand. Starting college that fall felt almost surreal after living primitively for a month, but I refused to let my skills get rusty. Between classes, I planned weekend expeditions of increasing complexity. Solo trips taught me self-reliance. Group trips helped me develop leadership skills. Every successful expedition built my confidence further. Looking back, maybe that confidence was the problem. By mid-November of my freshman year, I'd completed 8 solo trips and 4 group expeditions without serious incident. When my friend Zane expressed interest in learning survival skills, I immediately began planning an introductory trip. Olympic National Park seemed perfect. Its diverse terrain would provide excellent teaching opportunities, and its November weather would add an edge of challenge without being unnecessarily dangerous. Zane was an ideal student, athletic, attentive, and genuinely interested in learning. During our preparation sessions, he absorbed everything from basic knot tying to fire starting techniques. We spent hours going over maps, discussing contingency plans, and practicing essential skills in the campus courtyard. I planned everything meticulously. My pack contained redundant gear to accommodate a novice, extra fire starting materials, additional emergency supplies, and backup navigation tools. I'd even brought some commercial camping food alongside our foraging supplies, wanting to ease Zane into the experience rather than throwing him straight into primitive survival. The weather forecast showed typical November conditions for the Olympic Peninsula: temperatures in the low 40s, high humidity, and a constant chance of rain. Nothing we couldn't handle with proper preparation and equipment. We left campus Friday afternoon, my truck loaded with gear and our spirits high. The 2-hour drive to Olympic National Park gave me time to continue Zane's education, explaining how to read weather patterns and terrain features. The November sky hung low and gray, promising the kind of misty conditions typical of the Pacific Northwest. By the time we reached the trailhead, a heavy fog had settled in, transforming the familiar forest into something more primordial. Massive spruce trees loomed through the mist like ancient pillars, their upper branches lost in the low clouds. The temperature hovered around 40 degrees, cold enough to demand respect, but not enough to pose a serious threat to properly equipped hikers. My first mistake was starting late. The wan November sun was already declining by the time we shouldered our packs. I knew better. One of the fundamental rules of wilderness survival is to allow enough daylight for proper camp setup. But we were too excited to wait until morning. The trail conditions deteriorated quickly as we moved deeper into the park. Recent rains had left the ground soft and treacherous. Every step required careful attention, the kind of focus that draws your awareness down to a small circle of immediate concerns. Maybe that's why we didn't notice the silence sooner. About 2 hours in, I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd heard a bird call. The forest had gone quiet in a way that felt unnatural. Even the wind seemed muted, as if something was dampening all sound. Years of training had taught me to pay attention to these subtle warnings. When the forest goes silent, it usually means a predator is nearby. We needed to make camp before full darkness, and I spotted a massive spruce about 100 yards off trail that would provide natural shelter. I knew we were breaking park rules by going off trail, but I'd done it before without issues. The tree's sprawling branches created a cathedral-like space beneath, protected from the worst of the weather. Working quickly in the fading light, I taught Zane the basics of shelter construction. We gathered spruce boughs for bedding, positioned tarps for maximum protection, and created a small fire pit where the smoke would disperse through the branches. The process took longer than usual as I explained each step. Night fell faster than it should have, the fog seeming to thicken and pull the darkness down with it. As I demonstrated fire-starting techniques to Zane, I noticed how our voices seemed to stop dead in the air, as if the fog itself was swallowing the sound. Even the crack of the flint striker seemed muffled and wrong. The fire, when we finally got it going, cast strange shadows through the mist. More than once I caught myself staring into the darkness beyond our small circle of light, trying to make sense of shapes that seemed to move against the natural flow of the fog. The knocking started just as we were settling into our sleeping bags. At first it sounded distant, a hollow wooden impact that could have been anything. But it continued, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone methodically striking trees. The sound would stop for several minutes, then resume from a slightly different direction. "Probably elk," I told Zane, trying to project confidence. "Rutting season. They get aggressive." But even as I said it, I knew I was lying. I'd heard elk fighting before. This was different. The precision of it, the pattern. It suggested intelligence. The knocking continued for hours, moving in a rough circle around our camp, always maintaining the same distance. Sometimes it would speed up, become more intense, then slow back to its methodical rhythm. Around midnight we heard the first howl. It started low, almost subsonic, vibrating through the ground before rising to a pitch that made my teeth ache. Not a wolf, not a bear. Bears don't project like that. This sound carried intent. It was a communication, but not like anything I'd heard in my survival training. We lay awake, listening as the knocking and howls played out some kind of coordinated performance around us. The fog had grown so thick it seemed to press against our shelter like something solid. The fire died faster than it should have, the flames sinking into the earth as if being pulled down. Dawn brought no relief. The forest remained silent, the fog thick enough to turn trees 20 feet away into gray shadows. We packed quickly, both stealing glances into the murk around us. Several times I thought I saw movement, something large moving with deliberate slowness between the trees. But when I looked directly, there was only mist. We hiked hard that day, following game trails that paralleled the marked path. I kept checking my compass, making sure we maintained our general direction. The fog never fully lifted, creating a closed-in feeling that made every tree look identical. By mid-afternoon we reached the Gray Wolf River, its surface dark and fast-moving. The spot seemed perfect for a camp. Clear sight lines along the bank, plenty of driftwood for shelter, good fishing potential. We were about 200 yards off the main trail, but I figured that was safe enough. The first rock caught me completely off guard. It sailed past my head with frightening speed, larger than my fist, and splashed into the river. Before I could process what had happened, another one narrowly missed Zane. Then the stench hit us, a wall of putrid air that combined decay, musk, and something chemical. The closest comparison I can make is a skunk that died in a pool of stagnant water. But even that doesn't capture the alien quality of it. The footsteps came next. Something massive moved through the underbrush, its weight snapping branches like gunshots. The fog seemed to thicken, but through it I could make out a shape that defied everything I knew about North American wildlife. It stood upright. That detail stuck with me more than anything else. Not hunched like a bear, not crouched like a cat. It stood straight up, its head maybe 8 feet off the ground. The fog made details impossible, but the basic shape was unmistakably humanoid, though far too large and proportioned all wrong. "Hey!" I shouted, trying to sound authoritative despite my racing heart. "I have a gun! Back off!" I didn't have a gun. What I had was a hunting knife, and the sudden, crushing realization that all my survival training hadn't prepared me for this. The figure didn't react to my threat. Instead, it took one deliberate step forward. Through the fog, I could see massive shoulders, arms that hung too low, and what looked like matted hair covering its entire frame. The head was oddly shaped, sitting directly on those shoulders with no discernible neck. Zane and I did what seemed logical. We started throwing rocks back while yelling as loudly as we could. The creature retreated slowly into the fog, but not like something scared, It moved like a predator changing position, maintaining eye contact the whole time. "Pack up, now!" I grabbed my gear while scanning the tree line. The figure had disappeared, but I could feel its presence like static electricity on my skin. We didn't try to be subtle about our retreat. We crashed through the underbrush, heading straight for the main trail, all thoughts of stealth abandoned. Behind us, the knocking started again, but this time it was faster, more aggressive, and coming from multiple directions. For 4 hellish hours, we pushed ourselves to keep moving. The things stayed just out of sight, but their presence was constant. Sometimes we'd hear them paralleling our course, moving through the forest with impossible speed. Other times, we'd just catch that awful smell, or hear branches breaking far too high up in the trees. The knocking never stopped. It seemed to be some kind of communication. One set of knocks would sound ahead of us, another would answer from behind. They were coordinating, hurting us. As we got closer to civilization, the harassment intensified. More rocks flew past us, some close enough to hear the wind of their passage. The howling started again, but now it seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if the forest itself was screaming. The parking lot appeared suddenly through the fog like a mirage. We broke into a sprint, not stopping until we reached my truck. As I fumbled with the keys, I looked back one last time. There, at the edge of the forest, they stood watching. Not just one, but several, massive silhouettes perfectly still in the mist. As I started the engine, a final howl echoed across the parking lot. Not a threat this time, but almost like a warning. That experience changed how I approach wilderness survival. I still go out, the passion hasn't left me. But I do things differently now. I carry a gun, not because I think it would help against what we encountered, but because it helps me sleep at night. I've spent months researching similar encounters in the Olympic Peninsula. The official maps mark that area as simple wilderness, but the locals have other names for it. They talk about places where the trails don't quite match their maps, where time seems to flow differently, where things watch from just beyond the firelight. The knocking, I learned, is a common thread in many reports. Some theorize it's a form of communication, used to coordinate movement through the territory. The fact that our pursuers used it systematically, responding to each other across distance, suggests a level of intelligence I'm still trying to come to terms with. The local tribes have stories about those woods going back generations. They speak of territories that belong to neither man nor animal, of boundaries that shouldn't be crossed, of creatures that walk upright but aren't human. I used to dismiss these as folklore. Now I'm not so sure. What we encountered wasn't supernatural, I still believe that. But it was something outside our normal framework of understanding, something that has evolved alongside us but remained hidden, watching from the shadows of our civilized world. I still teach wilderness survival, but my lessons have changed. I teach people to read the forest's warnings, to understand that silence has meaning, that some territories aren't meant for us. And I tell them this: if you're ever in the deep woods and hear rhythmic knocking, walk the other way. If you smell something that makes your nose burn and your eyes water, run. And if the fog rolls in and you see something standing upright that's too tall to be human, don't try to be brave. Just get out. Because not everything that walks in those woods follows the rules we understand. And sometimes the most important survival skill is knowing when you're not welcome. The wilderness is vast and ancient, and we understand so little of what lives in its deeper shadows. Some questions are better left unanswered. Some territories are better left unexplored. But sometimes, in my dreams, I still hear that knocking. And I wonder if somewhere in those misty woods, they're waiting for us to venture off the trail again. The vast expanse of our family farm stretched out before me, a patchwork of fields and pastures blanketed in pristine snow. The land had been in our family for generations, nestled in the heart of an Indian reservation. As a child, I'd always felt a sense of otherness here, a white family living among the native population, privy to their customs and stories, but never truly part of their world. It was late December, and I found myself alone on the farm. My parents had left for their annual Christmas shopping trip to the city, leaving me in charge of the property and our livestock. At 25, I was more than capable of handling the responsibility, but there was something about the vast emptiness of the farm in winter that always set me on edge. The day had passed uneventfully, filled with the usual chores, feeding the animals, checking fences, and ensuring the pipes hadn't frozen. As night fell, I settled into the old farmhouse, grateful for the warmth of the wood stove and the comforting crackle of the fire. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the promise of more snow. I tried to focus on the book in my hands, but my mind kept wandering to the stories I'd heard growing up. Tales of skinwalkers and other supernatural beings that roamed these lands. I'd always dismissed them as nothing more than campfire tales, designed to scare children and outsiders. But on nights like these, with the wind moaning like a wounded animal, it was hard not to let the imagination run wild. It was well past midnight when I heard it, a cacophony of terrified bellowing from the cow pasture. I sat bolt upright, my heart racing. The sound was unmistakable. Something was spooking the cattle. My first thought was of the wild dogs that had become an increasing problem in recent years. Packs of feral canines, likely descended from abandoned pets, had been wreaking havoc on local livestock. I sprang into action, pulling on my heavy winter boots and thick coat. As an afterthought, I grabbed the old Mossberg 500 shotgun from its place above the door. It had been my grandfather's, and while I wasn't much for hunting, I knew how to handle it. I loaded it with buckshot, the weight of the weapon comforting in my hands. Stepping out into the night, I was momentarily disoriented by the brightness. A full moon hung low in the sky, its light reflecting off the snow-covered ground and creating an eerie, otherworldly glow. Thick clouds scudded across the sky, alternately obscuring and revealing the moon, casting shifting shadows across the landscape. The panicked lowing of the cattle grew louder as I approached the pasture. My breath came in short, visible puffs as I jogged through the snow, the cold air burning my lungs. As I crested a small rise, I saw them, two large, dark shapes in the middle of the field. At first glance, they appeared to be wolves, far larger than any dog I'd ever seen. They stood facing each other, reared up on their hind legs in what looked like a fight. Their fur was thick and matted, their eyes gleaming in the moonlight. For a moment I stood transfixed, watching this primal display of aggression. Then, training took over. I raised the shotgun, pumping a shell into the chamber. The sound echoed across the field, unnaturally loud in the still night air. And that's when everything changed. The two creatures stopped their fight abruptly, their heads swiveling in unison to face me. For a heartbeat, time seemed to stand still. Then, defying everything I thought I knew about animal behavior, they turned and ran, still on their hind legs. I stood rooted to the spot, my mind struggling to process what I'd just witnessed. The creatures moved with an unnatural gait, somewhere between a lope and a shambling run. Their front legs, or were they arms, swung at their sides as they disappeared into the tree line at the edge of the property. As the adrenaline began to fade, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. Every story I'd ever heard about skinwalkers came rushing back, no longer dismissible as mere legend. The Navajo tales of witches who could transform into animals, the whispered warnings about creatures that weren't quite human or beast, all of it suddenly felt terrifyingly real. I don't know how long I stood there, the shotgun hanging limply at my side. Eventually, the cold began to seep through my coat, and self-preservation kicked in. I made my way back to the house on shaky legs, constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every shadow. Once inside, I triple-checked every lock, drew all the curtains, and stoked the fire until the house was almost uncomfortably warm. Sleep was out of the question. I sat in my father's old armchair, the shotgun across my lap, and waited for dawn. As the first light of morning began to creep across the sky, I ventured out again. The pasture was churned up, with clear signs of the cattle's panic, but the animals themselves seemed unharmed. I searched the area where I'd seen the creatures, looking for tracks, fur, anything that might explain or at least corroborate what I'd witnessed. What I found only deepened the mystery. There were tracks, but they defied easy explanation. They started as clear canine prints, four-toed pads with claw marks, but then they changed. The back prints elongated, becoming almost human-like, while the front prints disappeared entirely. It was as if the creatures had suddenly started walking on their hind legs, exactly as I'd seen them do. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, going through the motions of my chores while my mind raced. Should I tell someone? Who would believe me? I thought about my native neighbors, wondering if they'd take me seriously or just see it as another white man appropriating their culture and beliefs. As night fell again, I found myself dreading the darkness in a way I never had before. Every sound from outside set my nerves on edge. The wind in the trees became the whisper of something stalking the house. The creak of the old farmhouse settling was transformed into footsteps on the porch. I didn't sleep that night or the next. By the time my parents returned, I was exhausted, jumpy, and questioning my own sanity. I thought about telling them what had happened, but the words stuck in my throat. How could I explain something I didn't understand myself? In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it had been a trick of the light, my tired mind playing tricks on me. Perhaps the tracks were just the result of animals walking over each other's prints. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had seen something that night, something that didn't fit into my understanding of the world. I began to pay more attention to the stories told by our native neighbors, no longer dismissing them as mere superstition. I started to notice things I'd overlooked before. The way some of the elders would make warding gestures when certain areas of the land were mentioned, the reluctance of some to be out after dark, the meaningful looks exchanged when talk turned to the unexplained. As winter gave way to spring and then to summer, the events of that night remained vivid in my memory. I never saw the creatures again, but I felt their presence everywhere. Every shadow in the woods held the potential for something otherworldly. Every unexplained sound in the night carried the echo of those inhuman footsteps. I've never spoken openly about what I saw that night, but sometimes, when the moon is full and the wind carries the hint of winter's chill, I find myself standing at the edge of that pasture, staring into the darkness. And I wonder, are they out there, watching me as I watch for them? And what would happen if one night they decided to do more than just run away? The experience changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. It opened my eyes to the possibility that the world is stranger and more mysterious than I'd ever imagined. It taught me respect for the beliefs and traditions of the people whose land we shared, and humility in the face of things I couldn't explain. As I stand here now, looking out over the farm that has been in my family for generations, I'm struck by how little we truly know about the world around us. The land holds secrets, some of which may be better left undiscovered. But that night in the snowy field, I glimpsed something beyond the veil of ordinary reality. And while part of me wishes I could forget, a larger part knows that I'm forever changed by that moment when the impossible became real. The mountains of Morgan County, Utah, have always held a special place in my heart. My step-grandparents owned a vast expanse of property there, and my siblings and I spent countless hours exploring the dense woods that lay just beyond their house. It was a world of wonder and adventure, a place where our imaginations could run wild and the boundaries of reality seemed to blur. But as I would come to learn, those woods held secrets far darker and more terrifying than anything I could have conceived of as a child. Fast forward 20 years, and I found myself drawn back to those mountains time and time again. My grandparents had long since passed away, but their legacy lived on in the land they had loved so dearly. I took to camping there whenever I could, relishing the solitude and the chance to reconnect with the wild beauty of the place. Being private property, the woods were usually deserted, with few other people venturing into their depths. It was a sanctuary of sorts, a place where I could escape the chaos of the modern world and lose myself in the timeless rhythms of nature. But as I would soon discover, the tranquility of those woods was a facade, a mask hiding something far more sinister. It was on one such camping trip that I first encountered the strange and inexplicable events that would come to haunt me. I was staying in a trailer on the property with two of my closest friends, enjoying a night of conversation and laughter. The air was still and heavy with the scent of pine, and the stars shone bright and clear in the inky sky above. And then, without warning, everything changed. A deafening roar filled the air, a sound like nothing I'd ever heard before. It was a vibrating, pulsing wind that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, shaking the trailer with a force that defied explanation. We clutched at each other in terror, our hearts pounding in our chests as the walls shook and trembled around us. For 30 seconds, maybe 45, the wind raged on, its fury seeming to build with every passing moment. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped, leaving us in a silence that was almost more unnerving than the noise had been. We looked at each other, our faces pale and drawn, our eyes wide with shock and confusion. What had just happened? What could have caused such a violent and localized disturbance? With trembling hands, we opened the door of the trailer and stepped outside, half expecting to see the world around us in ruins. But to our astonishment, everything was calm and still, the night as peaceful as it had been just moments before. There was no sign of a storm, no hint of the chaos that had just engulfed us. It was as if the wind had never existed at all. We searched the property, looking for any clue that might explain what we had just experienced. But there was nothing, no evidence of anything out of the ordinary, just the quiet, unassuming woods and the lingering sense of unease that we couldn't quite shake. It was the first of many strange and inexplicable events that would plague me in those woods, each one more unsettling than the last. There was the time I was hiking with two other friends, making our way towards a cabin I had discovered on a previous trip. To reach it, we had to climb over a gate and trek through a dense thicket of trees, the path ahead obscured by tall grass and undergrowth. I was the first to make it over the gate, my heart pounding with excitement at the thought of exploring the cabin once again. But as I pushed my way through the grass, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, sitting just 20 feet ahead of me on the path, was the largest dog I had ever seen. It was a behemoth of an animal, with long white fur and eyes that seemed to glow with an otherworldly darkness. It sat perfectly still, its gaze fixed on me with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. I froze, my mind racing as I tried to assess the situation. The dog was blocking the path, its massive form an unmovable obstacle between us and the cabin. I knew that if it decided to attack, we would be helpless against its size and strength. Slowly, carefully, I began to back away, motioning for my friends to do the same. They looked at me in confusion, not understanding the danger that lay ahead. I tried to explain, my voice barely more than a whisper as I told them about the dog, about the need to retreat before it was too late. But as we made our way back over the gate, my friends turned to me with expressions of utter bewilderment. They hadn't seen any dog, they said. The path had been clear, with no sign of the monstrous creature that had so terrified me. I couldn't understand it. I had seen the dog as clearly as I saw them now, its presence as real and undeniable as the ground beneath my feet. How could they not have seen it? What trick of the mind had conjured such a vivid and terrifying apparition? It was a question that would haunt me in the days and weeks that followed, as I tried to make sense of the strange and inexplicable things that kept happening in those woods. There was the time we were gathering firewood on a hillside across the road from our campsite. As we looked back towards camp, we saw something that defied all logic and reason. A door, a perfect, ordinary door, complete with a window and a doorknob, seemingly floating in mid-air at the base of a cluster of trees. We all saw it, all three of us, our jaws dropping in disbelief at the impossible sight before us. But we had no way to capture the moment, no cameras or phones to document the bizarre apparition. And so, like so many of the strange and unsettling things that happened in those woods, it lingered only in our memories, a phantom that danced at the edges of our understanding. As the years went by, I found myself drawn back to those mountains again and again, pulled by a force I couldn't quite explain. It was as if the woods were calling to me, whispering secrets in a language I couldn't quite understand. I began to research the history of the area, poring over old maps and records in search of any clue that might help me make sense of the strange and terrifying things I had witnessed. But the more I learned, the more questions I had. There were tales of disappearances in those woods, of hikers and campers who had ventured into the wilderness and never returned. Some spoke of strange lights in the night sky, of unearthly sounds that echoed through the trees. Others whispered of ancient burial grounds and cursed land, of spirits that lingered in the shadows and preyed on the unwary. The more I dug, the more I became convinced that there was something deeply wrong with those woods, something that defied all rational explanation. And yet I couldn't stay away, couldn't resist the pull of the unknown. It was on one of these later trips that I had my most terrifying encounter yet. I was camping alone, my tent pitched in a small clearing deep in the heart of the woods. The night was moonless and still, the only sound the distant hooting of an owl and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. I was just drifting off to sleep when I heard it, a soft, insistent scratching at the walls of my tent, like claws dragging across the fabric. My heart leapt into my throat, my body frozen with fear as I lay there, listening to the sound grow louder and more frenzied with each passing second. And then, through the thin nylon of the tent, I saw a shadow fall across the entrance, a dark and twisted shape that seemed to flicker and writhe in the dim light of my lantern. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as the shadow crept closer, its form shifting and changing in ways that defied all reason. I don't know how long I lay there, paralyzed with terror, my mind reeling with the impossible things I was seeing. But eventually, the scratching stopped, and the shadow vanished, leaving me alone in the darkness, my heart pounding and my body drenched in cold sweat. I fled those woods that night, tearing down my tent and racing back to my car with a desperation I had never known before. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to my core that I had brushed up against something ancient and evil, something that had no place in the world of the living. In the years since, I've tried to make sense of the things I experienced in those woods, to find some logical explanation for the impossible things I witnessed. But the truth is, there are some things in this world that defy all logic, some mysteries that are better left unexplored. And yet, even now, I find myself drawn back to those mountains, pulled by a force I can't quite explain. It's as if the woods are a part of me, a piece of my soul that I can never truly leave behind. But I know, deep in my heart, that I will never venture into those woods alone again. There are some secrets that are better left buried, some truths that are too terrible to face. And the mountains of Morgan County hold secrets that are better left undisturbed, horrors that are best left to the lonely whispers of the night wind. The decision to share my experiences, to give voice to the unspeakable things I had witnessed in those woods, did not come easily. For years, I had kept my memories locked away, buried deep in the recesses of my mind, where they could no longer haunt my waking hours. But as time passed, I began to realize that the weight of those secrets was slowly crushing me, eating away at my soul like a cancer. I knew that I had to speak out, to warn others of the dangers that lurked in those mountains, even if it meant facing the ridicule and disbelief of those who had never experienced the impossible. And so, with trembling hands and a heart heavy with dread, I began to write, pouring out the story of my encounters in those woods in all their terrifying detail. I spoke of the wind that had shaken our trailer with impossible force, of the ghostly door that had appeared in the middle of the forest, of the shadowy figure that had haunted my tent in the dead of night. I knew that my words would be met with skepticism, that many would dismiss my experiences as the ravings of a madman. But I also knew that there were others out there who had seen the same impossible things, who had felt the same icy touch of fear in the depths of those woods. And so I pressed on, driven by a desperate need to share my story, to find some measure of peace in the act of unburdening myself. I posted my account online in forums and chat rooms devoted to the paranormal and the unexplained, hoping against hope that someone, somewhere, would understand. At first, the response was slow, a trickle of comments and messages from curious strangers who had stumbled upon my story. But as word of my experiences spread, the floodgates opened, and I found myself inundated with stories of others who had encountered the same terrifying phenomena in those mountains. There were tales of hikers who had been stalked by impossible creatures, of campers who had been tormented by ghostly figures in the night. Some spoke of ancient Native American legends, of cursed burial grounds and vengeful spirits that haunted the land. Others whispered of government experiments gone wrong, of secret military bases hidden deep in the heart of the mountains. The more I read, the more I became convinced that there was something deeply, fundamentally wrong with those woods, something that defied all rational explanation. And yet, even as the weight of that knowledge threatened to crush me, I found a strange sort of solace in the shared experience of others, in the knowledge that I was not alone in my terror. I began to correspond with some of those who had reached out to me, forming a loose network of survivors who had all brushed up against the impossible in those mountains. We traded stories and theories, poring over old maps and historical records in search of any clue that might help us understand the forces at work in those woods. And as we dug deeper, a chilling picture began to emerge, a history of disappearances and unexplained phenomena that stretched back centuries, a pattern of darkness that had haunted those mountains for generations. It was as if the land itself was alive, a malevolent force that preyed on the unwary and the unlucky. But even as we searched for answers, we knew that there were some things that were better left unexplained, some horrors that were too terrible to confront head-on. And so we made a pact, a solemn vow to keep the secrets of those woods hidden, to protect others from the unspeakable fate that had nearly claimed us all. In the years since, I have tried to move on, to build a life for myself, far from the shadow of those mountains. But even now, I find myself haunted by the memories of what I experienced in those woods, by the knowledge that there are forces in this world that defy all rational explanation. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I find myself drawn back to those mountains, pulled by a force I can't quite explain. It's as if the woods are calling to me, whispering secrets in a language I can't quite understand. But I know, with a certainty that chills me to my core, that I will never again set foot in those mountains, never again venture into the heart of the darkness that lurks there. There are some things in this world that are better left undisturbed, some mysteries that are too terrible to unravel. And the mountains of Morgan County, Utah, hold secrets that are best left buried, horrors that are better left to the loneliness of the night and the haunted whispers of the wind in the trees. The anticipation was palpable as we embarked on our journey to Philmont Scout Ranch, the crown jewel of the Boy Scouts of America. Nestled in the rugged wilderness of New Mexico, Philmont was a place of legend, a vast expanse of untamed beauty that promised adventure and challenge in equal measure. As a Boy Scout, I had long dreamed of making the trek to Philmont, of testing my mettle against the harsh and unforgiving landscape that had shaped generations of young men before me. But even as I packed my bags and prepared for the journey, I couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled over me like a dark and heavy cloud. Perhaps it was the whispered rumors that had reached my ears in the days leading up to the trip, tales of strange and inexplicable happenings that had occurred on the trails of Philmont in years past. Or maybe it was the way the older scouts spoke of the place, their voices hushed and their eyes haunted, as if they had seen things that defied all rational explanation. Whatever the reason, I found myself gripped by a sense of foreboding as we set out on the first day of our trek, the weight of my backpack pressing down on my shoulders like a physical manifestation of the dread that coiled in the pit of my stomach. The first few days passed without incident, the long hours of hiking broken only by the occasional rest stop or campfire meal. But as we pushed deeper into the wilderness, I began to notice a change in the atmosphere around us, a sense of tension and unease that seemed to permeate the very air we breathed. It was on the fourth night of our trek that things took a turn for the strange and the terrifying. My friend and I were settling into our tent for the night, our bodies aching from the long miles we had covered that day. As we lay there in the darkness, our whispered conversation turned to the topic of the Native Americans who had once called this land their home. My friend spoke of the legends that had been passed down through the generations, tales of shape-shifting creatures and malevolent spirits that lurked in the shadows of the forest. And then he mentioned the skinwalkers, the dark and twisted beings that were said to haunt the wilderness of the Southwest. I felt a chill run down my spine at the mere mention of the word, a sense of unease that I couldn't quite shake. But my friend was insistent, his voice low and urgent as he warned me of the dangers of speaking their name aloud. "Names have power," he said, his eyes glinting in the dim light of our tent. "You don't want to draw their attention." I scoffed at his words, dismissing them as nothing more than superstitious nonsense. But even as I lay there in the darkness, trying to will myself to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something ancient and malevolent was lurking just beyond the flimsy walls of our tent. It was then that the screaming began, a sound that tore through the night like a jagged blade. It was a sound unlike anything I had ever heard before, a twisted and distorted wail that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. At first I thought it might be the cry of a wounded animal, some hapless creature that had fallen victim to the predators that roamed the wilderness. But as the screaming continued, rising and falling in an eerie cadence, I began to realize that there was something deeply wrong about the sound, something that defied all logical explanation. For hours the screaming went on, a relentless and unearthly chorus that seemed to pierce the very fabric of reality. I lay there in my sleeping bag, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing with 1,000 terrifying possibilities. What could be making such a sound? What dark and twisted creature could be lurking out there in the darkness, its voice raised in a cry of hunger or rage? I didn't have an answer, and as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I found myself slipping into an uneasy and fitful sleep, my dreams haunted by visions of pale and twisted figures that danced at the edges of my consciousness. The next day dawned bright and clear. The horrors of the night before seemingly vanished in the warm light of the sun, but even as we set out on the trail once more, I couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled over me like a shroud. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig underfoot sent a jolt of fear racing through my veins. I found myself jumping at shadows, my eyes darting from side to side as if expecting some nameless terror to leap out at me from the undergrowth. My friend seemed to sense my unease, his own face drawn and haggard in the early morning light. But he said nothing, merely shouldering his pack and setting off down the trail with a grim determination that bordered on desperation. As the day wore on, the sense of foreboding that had gripped me since the previous night only seemed to grow stronger. The forest around us seemed to take on a sinister and malevolent air, the trees looming over us like twisted sentinels, their branches reaching out to snag at our clothing and skin. And then, just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, we arrived at our campsite for the night. It was a small clearing nestled in the heart of the forest, surrounded on all sides by a dense thicket of trees and underbrush. As we set about the task of making camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something was lurking just beyond the edges of the firelight, waiting for the right moment to strike. And then, just as I was beginning to drift off to sleep, the screaming began again. It was closer this time, the sound seeming to come from just beyond the flimsy walls of my tent. I sat bolt upright, my heart pounding in my chest, my eyes straining to pierce the darkness beyond the flickering light of our campfire. And that's when I saw it. A figure, pale and gaunt, moving through the trees at the edge of the clearing. It was hard to make out in the dim light, but I could see that there was something deeply wrong about the way it moved, its limbs seeming to twist and contort in ways that defied all human anatomy. I let out a strangled cry, my voice seeming to stick in my throat as I fumbled for my flashlight. But even as I raised the beam of light to illuminate the figure, it vanished into the darkness, leaving behind only a lingering sense of dread and the echo of that unearthly scream. I didn't sleep that night, my mind racing with 1,000 terrifying possibilities. What was that thing that I had seen? Was it some twisted product of my own imagination, born of the fear and unease that had gripped me since we had first set foot in this cursed place? Or was it something else entirely? Some dark and malevolent force that had been drawn to us by the very act of speaking its name aloud? I didn't have an answer, and as the long hours of the night dragged on, I found myself slipping deeper and deeper into a spiral of fear and paranoia. The next morning we broke camp early, our faces drawn and haggard in the pale light of dawn. No one spoke of what had happened the night before, but I could see the same haunted look in the eyes of my fellow scouts, the same sense of unease that had gripped me since the first night of our trek. As we set off down the trail once more, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed, that something was stalking us through the wilderness, biding its time until the moment was right to strike. And then, on the final night of our trek, my worst fears were realized. We had just finished setting up camp for the night, the flickering light of our campfire casting eerie shadows on the trees around us. I was sitting by the fire, trying to warm my hands against the chill of the night air, when I heard my name being called from one of the nearby tents. It was one of my fellow scouts, his voice high and panicked as he called out to me through the flimsy walls of his shelter. "Hey, can you shine a light out here?" he cried, his words tumbling over each other in his haste to get them out. "I think I saw something moving outside my tent." I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to quell the rising tide of fear that threatened to overwhelm me. But I knew that I couldn't leave my friend alone in the darkness, not with the horrors that lurked in the shadows of this place. So I grabbed my flashlight and made my way over to his tent, my steps slow and cautious as I scanned the darkness around me for any sign of movement. And that's when I saw it. A leg, pale and bony, disappearing behind a row of tents on the far side of the clearing. But it wasn't a human leg, or even an animal leg. It was something else entirely, a twisted and elongated limb that ended in a grotesque parody of a human foot. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I stared at the spot where the leg had vanished. And then, as if on cue, the screaming began again, that same unearthly wail that had haunted my dreams since the first night of our trek. I don't remember much of what happened next. All I know is that I ran, my feet pounding against the hard-packed earth as I fled through the darkness, the screams of my fellow scouts echoing in my ears. I don't know how long I ran or how far. All I know is that when I finally collapsed, my lungs burning and my legs trembling beneath me, I was alone in the darkness, the campsite far behind me. I lay there for a long time, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to catch my breath. And then, slowly, I began to realize the true horror of my situation. I was lost, alone in the wilderness, with no idea of how to find my way back to the safety of the campsite. And worse still, I was being hunted by something that defied all rational explanation, a creature born of darkness and shadow that seemed to exist for no other purpose than to torment and terrorize. I don't know how long I wandered through those woods, my mind numb with fear and exhaustion. Minutes stretched into hours, and hours into days, until time itself seemed to lose all meaning. I saw things in those woods, things that I still can't bring myself to speak of, even now. Twisted and misshapen figures that lurked at the edges of my vision, their bodies contorted into impossible shapes that seemed to defy the very laws of nature. And always there was the screaming, that same unearthly wail that seemed to pierce the very fabric of reality itself. I don't know how I survived those long and terrible days in the wilderness. Perhaps it was sheer dumb luck, or perhaps it was some twisted grace of the very creatures that hunted me. But somehow, against all odds, I found my way back to civilization, stumbling out of the woods and into the arms of a search party that had been scouring the wilderness for days in search of me. I was a changed man, my mind and body scarred by the horrors I had witnessed in those dark and twisted woods. And even now, years later, I find myself haunted by the memories of that fateful trek, the visions of pale and twisted figures dancing at the edges of my consciousness. But there is one thing that I have learned from my ordeal, one lesson that I will carry with me for the rest of my days. Never speak the name of that which you fear, for names have power, and there are some things in this world that are best left unnamed and unacknowledged. I learned that lesson the hard way, and it is a lesson that I will never forget. For in the dark and twisted heart of the wilderness, there are creatures that defy all human understanding, beings of shadow and darkness that exist for no other purpose than to feed on the fear and despair of the living. And once you have drawn their attention, once you have spoken their name aloud and invited them into your world, there is no escape, no refuge from the horror that they bring. So if you ever find yourself in those woods, if you ever feel the icy touch of fear upon your skin and hear the distant echo of an unearthly scream, remember my warning. Don't speak their name, don't acknowledge their presence, and above all, don't let them know that you are afraid. For fear is the very essence of their being, the dark and twisted nectar that sustains them in their endless hunt. And once they have tasted your fear, once they have drunk deep of the terror that flows through your veins, they will never let you go, never release you from the nightmare that has become your waking life. So run, if you can. Flee back to the safety of the civilized world and never look back. But know this, they will be waiting for you, in the shadows and the darkness, in the twisted heart of the wilderness that lies just beyond the edge of your understanding. And they will never, ever let you forget the horror that you have witnessed, the nightmare that you have brought upon yourself by your own foolish actions. For in the end, there is no escape from the skinwalkers, no refuge from the dark and twisted beings that haunt the wilderness of the Southwest. There is only survival, and the slim and desperate hope that someday, somehow, you will find a way to outrun the horror that stalks you, the nightmare that has become your waking life. But even then, in the dark and quiet moments when you are alone with your thoughts and your memories, you will always hear the distant echo of that unearthly scream, the twisted and distorted wail that will haunt you for the rest of your days. And you will know, with a certainty that chills you to your very core, that you will never be truly free, never be truly safe, as long as the skinwalkers still walk the earth, their pale and twisted forms forever lurking at the edges of your consciousness, waiting for the moment when your guard slips and your fear betrays you once again. For that is the true horror of the skinwalkers, the dark and twisted secret that lies at the heart of their being. They are not just hunters, not just predators that stalk the living for their own twisted pleasure. They are a manifestation of the very darkness that lies within the human soul, the shadow that lurks within us all, waiting for the moment when we let our guard down and allow it to consume us utterly. And once they have claimed you, once they have made you one of their own, there is no turning back, no escape from the nightmare that your life has become. You will walk the earth as one of them, your flesh twisted and pale, your eyes forever haunted by the horrors that you have witnessed. And you will know, with a certainty that goes beyond all human understanding, that you have become something other than human, something dark and twisted and utterly irrevocably damned. So take heed, my friend, and remember my warning. For the skinwalkers are out there, waiting in the darkness, their pale and twisted forms forever lurking at the edges of our world. And if you are not careful, if you let your guard down for even a moment, they will claim you as their own, and you will be lost forever, a twisted and broken thing, forever haunted by the horrors that you have witnessed, the nightmare that you have become.